Hi, this is Tamsen Granger.
This is Dan Abuhoff.
With Tamsen and Dan Read the Paper on Sunday, September 23rd, 2018. Another gloomy Sunday.
Raining.
Raining again.
Yep.
And cold. Now it's fall. And it's officially fall.
Yes.
So there you have it.
Right. But it's a big day because the Giants won today. The Giants don't win very often.
Oh, really? The Giants won. How about the Mets? Are the Mets winning?
They are winning.
Ah! It's a red letter day for you.
It is.
Okay, so I had an interesting week.
Yes.
I got a call from the FBI.
Really?
Yes, we didn't know this. Don't act surprised.
Well, I don't know. If you want to disclose something to everybody now for the first time, this will be a real story for us.
No. It's not much of a story. It was in relation to that Kavanaugh thing. Because, as I've mentioned...
Kavanaugh man, yes, what?
I said the Kavanaugh thing.
All right, go ahead.
As I've mentioned many times, I did go to Holton Arms, school for girls.
Right.
And as we've mentioned several times, my brother went to Georgetown Prep.
Right, and so we have a story in Kavanaugh about a woman who was at Holton Arms who went to a party and... she had perhaps a run-in with a fellow from Georgetown Prep.
So obviously they were researching this a little bit, why they called me.
Let me put it differently.
Like 100 years older than the...
So to get to the bottom of it, the FBI goes in the one source you'd expect, you, Tamsen Granger, Holton Arms / Georgetown Prep.
Well, I didn't talk to them.
No.
Just so you know.
Yes.
They left a message.
We don't even know if it was the FBI, but...
yeah, it was probably People magazine, don't you think?
Yes. Or some bigger magazine, yeah.
It's crazy that they would call me. There's no way I would know those people. My sister went to Holton, too, and she's closer in age. But
she didn't get the call.
It was fun to know that somebody... wanted to talk to me.
Look, it probably was the FBI, and they'll find you eventually. That's the way the FBI is. They're relentless.
Really?
Yes, they'll track you down.
Okay, so that was that, and with that in mind,
that whole issue brings to mind something that came up in the Wall Street Journal in a little bit of an oblique way, but perhaps not so oblique, and that is a story entitled "The Humanities Decline Makes Us Morally Obtuse." Yeah,
this was on their op-ed page. And it was really pretty interesting, and I thought on point in talking about the complexity of all these accusations, discussions, accusers, victims, etc. And this writer, Paula Marantz Cohen, attributes some of our conflict and our inability to sort all these things out as a failure of education. By education, she says, I do not mean the workshops that teach us what not to say or do or to avoid offending others. That is training, not education. I'm not sure how well that actually sticks, she puts in parentheses. The assumption these days is that people are monolithic, either completely good or completely bad. The best way to repudiate that assumption is to study the humanities, which illuminate human life in all its complexity. How can you think about crime or misconduct in such an unimaginative way if you've read great literature? Example, adultery, after Anna Karenina, bad parenting, after Death of a Salesman, political extremism, and even murder, after Julius Caesar. The greatness of these works, says Ms. Cohen, is that they don't excuse the conduct in question, but they do help explain it as a function of human frailty and misguided motives, sometimes of the most high-minded sort. They expose the backstory that otherwise would be hidden from us so that we can, if not sympathize, at least go some way toward understanding what happened. They humanize what would otherwise look like simple stupidity or evil. You want to jump in here?
Yeah, well, I think that's true. I mean, it's nuance. And if there's one thing, without taking any sides here, and it's almost silly to take sides because no one knows what the heck's going on with the Kavanaugh accusation. But there's no nuance in any discussion. What you have, and it's almost comical, is that whoever wants to put forward a particular point of view jumps on one fact, one facet, and pounds that like a nail into a board, as if that's the single truth that guides the whole situation. And the only way to reach any kind of reasoned understanding of what may have happened and what to do with the information is to take a little bit of more sophisticated view of things, which is what goes on in these texts, in this literature. That's what it's all about. It's all about nuance, understanding people more deeply, understanding situations more deeply.
And the complexity.
And the complexity.
Of people.
Yes.
Not boiling it down.
Yeah. I mean, I will say another quote in the same article. The humanities teach understanding, but they also teach humility, that we may be wrong and our enemies may be right, that the past can be criticized without our necessarily feeling superior to it, that people's professed motives are not the whole story, and that the division of the world into oppressors and victims is a simplistic fairy tale. That's what we're living, a simplistic fairy tale. And it's bizarre. But, you know, I don't want to blame anybody.
Good guys and bad guys.
It's always good guys and bad guys. And you just have to choose.
Well, you know, when you're very young,
yeah,
there are good guys and bad guys.
Right.
There's right and wrong. There's good and evil. And it seems as you grow up,
right,
all of that becomes very gray. And you struggle, I think, in your adult life with the nuances and, you know, what is good and what is evil. But
the discussion you have now is not a grown-up discussion. And know something? And no one expects a grown-up discussion between the politicians on the one hand and the press on the other. You're just not going to find that. And it's terribly bizarre.
And you know, the point is here that, in part, is that we need to maintain, you know, our study of everything, literature, history, philosophy, not just
right,
the sexy subjects of the times.
Well,
the scientific subjects.
Yeah, not so much sexy as economically rewarding, and that people feel that.
Well,
that's
I think that's where we find sexiness in this day and age. To be honest.
But look, here's a parallel story. It's a total coincidence. David Boies. David Boies, you know, a very well-known lawyer, litigator, who's had a lot of high-profile cases. He's had a very rough year. He's been criticized, some think fairly, because he represented extremely aggressively two notorious figures. One is Elizabeth Holmes, the woman who was the head of Theranos, which was the sort of flashy, very exciting blood testing pharmaceutical operation, which was exposed later as a fraud. And the second figure being Harvey Weinstein, who everyone knows who Harvey Weinstein is. And what Boies was criticized for was aggressing both those individuals very aggressively, perhaps too aggressively. And in some corners, he was probably criticized just for representing them, quite frankly, even though that's what lawyers do for a living. But what's interesting about the Boies discussion is it's a long interview. And this is in the journal. And at one point, and Boies is very well spoken, and he makes the point very effectively that a lawyer is one thing and his client is something else, and you're just trying to represent someone. It doesn't mean you're the same as that person. Having said that, he's sensitive to the accusation that he stayed with these clients too long and perhaps went too far in trying to defend them. And following the interview, he actually ends up writing a long email back to the interviewer. They say 1,000 words. And he says this. He says, like I often do following a particularly good discussion or a movie or play, I keep thinking about what we covered. In other words, the references again, it might as well be movie, play, might as well be literature. I mean, as he reflects on a situation and thinks more about the nuance. And he says, frankly, after giving it more deep thought, it's very complex, but I do come to the conclusion that, in fact, in the one case, I stayed with Weinstein too long. I showed too much loyalty for a client I should have fired because I should have realized that there was a problem there I didn't know before. And frankly, with Theranos, I should have never taken the representation on because I didn't know enough. But it's all on long reflection. And again, the reference to a broader landscape. a more thoughtful approach. And again, that's exactly what I guarantee it. I don't know what the result's going to be this week with Cava and all the accusations, but it's not going to be thoughtful. You can bet on that.
Right.
So that's where we
are.
are.
Well, again, I mean, we've talked about this before. The idea that studying the humanities can help develop a sort of an affinity for, or at least an acknowledgement of the complexity of problems and maybe how to begin to solve them.
Right.
Whether you're a computer coder or a lawyer.
As opposed to this person's bad, this person's good, this person goes to hell, this person goes to heaven, which is the kind of discussion we have. And that is doomed to failure. So I know where we're going with that one.
On a lighter note.
So
New York.
Every once in a while, there are a couple of stories you read in the paper one weekend, and you say, "This is only in New York." For better or worse, often it's better. So one is a story about something called Club Cumming. Club Cumming is a nightclub in the East Village, which is owned by Alan Cumming. Alan Cumming, very well-known musical Broadway star, and also on television in all kinds of shows. Good
we
Wife,
love him.
among
Do you love
other
him?
things.
I love him.
Yeah, he made his name first in Cabaret.
Right.
He was fantastic in that, but he's been all kinds of things. He's a well-known Scottish dramatic actor, but he's also a singer. He cuts a few albums. He's a witty guy.
He introduces Masterpiece Theater or something sometimes.
It's Masterpiece.
I can't
Masterpiece
do Scottish.
But let me do it again without uncanny. Masterpiece. Wasn't that good?
No.
Tamsen had her eyes closed.
Oh.
Okay. Did it sound like Lindley? No?
Go.
In any event, he is a nightclub. And you go to the East Village, and
he might be there.
It sounds like he's very likely going to be be there. Once in a while,
the man has to work sometimes.
This is sort of working
to finance the bar.
I don't know. He might make money. He will come to the microphone, or he will sing a song or two. Sometimes from Cabaret, sometimes from something else, and then he will just leave and
he'll pour some drinks.
He'll tend bar. He said he always wanted to be a bartender. And they'll make an announcement that says Alan has to go because the bar is overrun. And they need somebody else to tend bar. And he goes to tend bar. And he says that, now that I have my own bar, I get to be a bartender. He always wanted to be a bartender. The problem is he's not great at making drinks. He doesn't know that much about making drinks. So he says if someone asks for a tequila sunrise, I might say, how about a tequila and soda? And they say, okay. Or if I make a mistake of giving a whiskey and cranberry to someone who ordered a whiskey and Coke, nobody says anything. Everybody seems perfectly pleased to get the drink. Maybe because they're excited to get the drink from Alan Cumming. And that's really what the truth of it is. So it's a lot of fun, but again, only in New York. I mean, I'll ask you, Tamsen, if you got the wrong glass of wine from Alan Cumming at the bar, what would you say?
There is no wrong glass of wine from Alan Cumming.
There you go. That's the same idea. All right, so here's something which is a little more challenging, but I still think it's sort of only in New York.
This is like super challenging. This is not a little more
this challenging. This is challenging. This is only someone with a long commute could have gotten through this article, but I think it was worth it. It was a review of a play, which is called Hathaway Memory of Fire, which is being performed at
Hathaway,
Hattuey, which is being performed at Montclair State College, and it's a bizarre backstory, but it's a new opera. Really, by a fellow named Frank London. And here's the story. The story is that there was a poet whose name was Oscar Pinnis. Cleverly changed his name later to Asher Penn for obvious reasons. But in any event, he had been struck by sort of a folk tale of a difficult situation in Latin America, wrote a long poem, 16th century story that he memorialized in a poem. And what Frank London does is he dramatizes the writing of this long poem. I should mention the poem was in Yiddish because Oscar Pinnis was Jewish and spoke Yiddish. So
somebody wrote a long poem.
Right. About
Yiddish,
about a 16th century.
About a character
in the 16th century. That's right.
In where was he? Latin America? Where? Pinnis was a Ukrainian Jew. Yes, in Cuba.
But what he does is, let me just walk through it. It gets a little bit crazy.
Move quickly, because I am dozing off.
All right, so here's the way it works.
A, opera, B...
All right, so again, Pinnis writes the long Yiddish poem about the situation in the 16th century. London writes an opera in which Pinnis is a character. The character Pinnis is now in a more modern nightclub in Cuba in like the 1950s, 1960s, where people are being oppressed by the dictator in Cuba at that time. They are getting ready to fight the dictator. Pinnis meets and falls in love with a character who's a performer at the nightclub. She persuades him to help them put together a performance of his poem.
Let's put on a show.
Put on a show, which is, again, about political oppression. But the trick is now, but it's still going to be in Yiddish. So you have the Latin American nightclub performers performing a show in Yiddish based on the Pinnis poem to Latin American beat. Okay? You've got Latin songs and salsa singing the songs all in Yiddish. All right? And that is the opera.
All right.
All right. So what did they say about the opera? They say the audience responded with warmth and enthusiasm for New Yorkers interested in salsa, social justice, and oy veys in aria form. It's worth the schlep.
Maybe.
All right. Long story, I know. But
well, you can go to it and report back.
Yeah, okay.
All right.
That's my plan.
Were you going to talk about the real estate?
No, that's not Charlie.
No, we were reading about a young couple.
Yeah.
That has a fabulous new apartment in Hudson Yards.
Yeah.
And the building has 4 different swimming pools.
Right.
Like a saltwater pool, a lap pool, a hot pool, a cold pool. For 2 bedrooms, they only have to pay $8,600 a month.
Right. And so he meets, just to finish the New York story, he meets the woman who's the trainer at the gym he's working at.
She turns out to be a rockette.
Naturally. And the 2 of them are happy as clams in Hudson Yards.
And he becomes partner at his law firm.
There you go.
So he's living the dream.
Living the dream. Only in New York. Okay?
Okay.
$8,600 a month. Yeah. So, but you had more.
It could be yours.
You had more conventional theater, right?
Well, I was just reading I was noticing a picture of Glenn Close in the Arts and Leisure section. And it turns out she's opening in a play at the Public this week. It's starting previews.
Right.
It's not really opening. And it's called Mother of the Maid.
Right.
And it's about the mother of Joan of Arc.
We've always wondered about her.
And the difficulties of raising,
I can just imagine, yes. A saint.
A saint. Well, and also, a gifted child.
Right. A difficult, a headstrong child.
Anyway, so turns out it was written by Jane Anderson.
Right.
Who was involved in writing The Wife.
Which Glenn
The
Close,
movie that Glenn Close is in now.
No coincidence there.
And she's also she's done writing for Mad Men, Facts of Life, and a lot of stuff we're familiar with. Mm-hmm. Anyway.
But the story...
This is not a new play.
Right.
Apparently there was a production of it by Shakespeare and Company, directed by the same Matthew Penn, who's directing it at the Public in 2015.
But the story is that they've already extended it, and they haven't even started previews.
Well, that's the thing. When I Googled it, all the headlines are about it being extended. So that makes me super curious.
Yeah,
I mean,
so
there seems to be buzz
like Hamilton.
that this is going to be good.
That's what happened with Hamilton.
Unless it's just because the star vehicle.
No,
because
I
Glenn
wonder.
Close is
I think
in
there's
it.
something going on there. I think you're right on that.
So, look for that. Mother of the Maid.
Right.
With Glenn Close at the Public. Okay, moving right along here. Also, if you're looking for a book to read, and you're interested in art, and you're interested in women in art in the 20th century, you might want to find 9th Street Women by Mary Gabriel. It says here in the Wall Street Journal, it's 927 pages.
Yikes.
And anyway, it's described by this reviewer, Ann Landy, as a sweeping and deliciously readable biography focusing on 5 painters: Elaine de Kooning, Lee Krasner, Joan Mitchell, Grace Hartigan, and Helen Frankenthaler. So this seems quite interesting. It's an interesting period of time. It's women who are intersecting with some interesting guys, especially de Kooning and Jackson Pollock, etc., and women who are interesting artistically in their own right, and just, their lives seem pretty interesting. Wall Street Journal article quotes from the book, a quote by Helen Frankenthaler: "I don't resent being a female painter. I don't exploit it. I paint." And so that seems to have potential. Lots of...
Right. So the title again is Ninth Street Women by Mary Gabriel. And you were talking about the movie that we didn't get a chance to see yet because it hasn't opened in the far reaches of the country. But
well, yeah, one movie we didn't mention last week in our preview show also is Tea with Dames. And I've been reading a lot about that. It has opened. It's getting some pretty good reviews. Everybody seems to think it's fun. It's an interview, a documentary by Roger Mitchell with 4 actors: Eileen Atkins, Maggie Smith, Judi Dench, Joan Plowright. And several of them were in that movie Tea with Mussolini, which goes back to 1999. Pretty complex plot, but kind of a fun movie. And, I feel like I should go back and see it again. It also had Cher and Lily Tomlin in it.
Really?
Yeah.
How?
I
will say.
Anyway,
I saw
this is supposed to be a fun discussion with these women. Michael Williams was in the Tea with the Mussolini movie. He was married to Judi Dench. Mm-hmm. He passed away. This was his last movie before he died. Well, actually. Anyway, so there's a lot of good. Apparently, there's a lot of good snarky remarks. Well, in this documentary, so that would be fun to see. Tea with Dames.
We'll talk about spouses. I know that Joan Plowright says in the movie that who's blind now, I think, that she was married to Laurence Olivier, famously, and she says it was interesting being married to Laurence, but it was kind of a nightmare, right? You know. Everybody goes, yes, we know. So there you go, Laurence Olivier. Okay, so only in New York, we go to only in China. And that's there's such a thing as only in China. So a fellow named Shan Chenfang, who passed away, who was responsible for revitalizing the Chinese folk storytelling tradition. And it's kind of a very interesting life story. He set out in a career in something called Ping Shu, the Ping Shu tradition. But the way the Ping Shu tradition went, you had storytellers who would go around in tribal settings or whatever and tell these elaborate stories. And there were stories all about gods and goddesses and, fantastic things happening. And he got involved in it because it was sort of a family thing, but he immediately realized that it would mean much more to him if he could change it, if he could bring it down to earth a little bit. And he studied history quite a bit. And he sort of corrected the stories, shortened the stories, made them more real. And
so he's tweaking the stories.
For
quite
a bit.
Audience.
And he made them more compelling. Uh-huh. And he was really kind of hitting his stride. And he felt really adding something to Chinese culture. And then the People's Republic of China in the revolution caught up with him. And they said, well, maybe you're being a little too frank, and maybe we're not entirely clear what you're doing, so you're going to go for re-education. And his career was derailed from 1966 to 1976 in what was, in his mind, clearly just a detour, a waste of time, and a terrible time for him.
Was he put in jail? Or?
He was put in a sort of a re-education center, if you will put it that way. But then he's back. And he's back, and he becomes tremendously popular. And for 2 reasons. One is he's got this new way of telling these stories, and it's much more compelling and much more interesting to the average person. And number 2, he has a different way of reaching people, and that's called radio. Turns out everybody in 1976 in China had a radio and paid much attention to it. And before you knew it, he was like the biggest star
He
on
was
the
a radio
Yes.
sensation.
Over 6 decades, he now recorded more than 110 stories for radio and television, totaling about 12,000 episodes and spanning 6,000 hours. And he was sort of an overnight, not overnight viral sensation in China and revitalized the storytelling tradition in a very modern way. So that I found that pretty interesting. The other thing in China that I found pretty interesting was there's a product in China that we haven't seen here, which I found remarkable. And it is a teeny car. They have a giant market for it, as the journal puts it, teeny cars. And I'm looking at a car, and this is not actual size, but you can barely fit a single person in it. And it is really a glorified go-kart. It goes between 30 and 45 miles an hour. It costs only $1,000 to buy.
Mm-hmm.
Is
it electric?
Yes, it is electric.
So it's really an e-bike with a recovery.
That's exactly.
It's a little
what
bit
it is.
safer,
but
maybe than an e-bike.
So and not terribly safe, right? So
Okay.
it doesn't have a lot of or any bells and
Does
whistles
it have
to go to
brakes?
safety. It has brakes, but it's not going to withstand much in terms of a collision. People in real cars don't love being behind it because it doesn't really accelerate too terribly well. On the other hand, people say they can afford this car. It beats being on a bicycle. It beats walking. It beats being on a scooter. They have to take their kids somewhere that's a mile away or something like that. It's raining. They're in this little car. They can all squeeze in. It's tremendously functional.
They can all squeeze in?
They can. That's what they say. And they sold, 1.75 million of these so-called micro EVs. That means they're electric. Was sold in China last year. More than twice the sales of regular electric vehicles. Now, this is an industry that doesn't exist, as far as I know, in the U.S. And the other thing is because they're closer to go-karts than cars, you don't need a driver's license to drive them.
Yeah, well, that's going to be having something like that on the road with real cars would be very complicated.
You can see the issues, and I'm not saying it should be swallowed wholesale, but you can understand the appeal of it. People say, I don't feel that comfortable being out in the elements or being on a bicycle, being whatever. If I could just hop in this little car and go 6 blocks or 8 blocks, I can do it. You can fit 3 in one parking space. And money talks. It's a tremendous seller in China.
Well, that's interesting.
We just went car shopping for a few minutes yesterday and talk about the opposite sensibility. We were stunned. We were at a Volvo dealership. You couldn't find a normal sized car at the Volvo dealership. These cars were like brontosauruses. Huge cars. And this is a different approach to things. And I guess China's a little different than the U.S. So we'll see.
Okay. So I'm just going to make a brief mention of a couple of new books covering the latest sex symbol of the founding fathers of the United States of America. That would be Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was, apparently an unsung hero of the revolution and the beginning of the U.S. A new book has been written by Stephen Fried called Rush, Revolution, Madness, and the Visionary Doctor Who Became a Founding Father. That's by Stephen Fried. Then there's also a book by Harlow Giles Unger, Dr. Benjamin Rush, the Founding Father Who Healed a Wounded Nation. I mean, this is clearly an amazing guy we've never heard of. There's a terrific eulogy from Thomas Jefferson, who called Rush a better man than Rush could not have left us. He knew of no one living or dead who had done more real good in America. This is Jefferson talking about him. And we haven't even ever heard of him. Well, I've heard of him a little bit. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was from the Philadelphia area. He ends up being identified as a gifted child and goes to Princeton, gets accepted at Princeton at age 13. That's back when Princeton is still called the College of New Jersey. He graduates in a year, okay, and then starts studying to be a doctor and ends up in Scotland. Once he's in Scotland, he gets introductions to Benjamin Franklin, who is over there in the UK, and he starts making friends. He comes back to Philadelphia, develops a reputation and a career as a doctor and a professor of medicine, and is, a tremendous sort of activist for public health, against slavery. And, by the way, he becomes friends with Thomas Paine and encourages him to publish a pamphlet which Rush, tells him he should call Common Sense. And he's involved in the Revolutionary War. Maybe one of the reasons we haven't heard of him is he has a tiff with George Washington. He actually writes to somebody and says maybe Washington should be fired because, this and that and the other thing, mostly about hygiene in the army, is not being accomplished. So he's complex. We also have a receipt of his purchase of a slave. So I just said he's an abolitionist.
Yeah.
So that's curious. Did he buy the slave so he could free the slave? A lot of this is not quite understood. He trained many, many, many doctors. Think about when this was, at the at the end of the 18th century, and, the beginnings of America, you really needed doctors. They say he trained at least 3,000 doctors. But for himself, he was old school. He never gave up the practice of bloodletting, which didn't really work, but he thought it did. So anyway, there are many, many interesting stories. These are taken from his letters. They have a fair amount of his letters, and many of them were rather intimate. And they think that's perhaps one of the reasons we don't know much about him, because there was a fear of people who were writing to him, like Jefferson and Adams, who apparently even told them of their bathroom habits. I don't even know what that means. But anyway, I don't know if there's going to be a musical, but might be interesting.
Yeah, maybe.
To read a little bit about him. Let me throw something out here that I didn't mention to you, and that is there's quite a big article about Cava in the Wall Street Journal.
Oh, yeah, I saw that.
You're familiar with Cava.
Spanish
You being a big fan of Frexenet.
Frexenet's, yeah.
For the simple reason that it costs about $7.99 a bottle. It's
inexpensive. I think it's up to $9.99, but even so, I've spread it around.
So inexpensive Spanish sparkling wine.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with it. You could do a lot worse than Frexenet.
Well, the wine writer looks into it and finds out there's still a lot of bad Cava out there. Frexenet is one of them.
Oh, really?
But there's some good ones as well. Yes.
Do they recommend anything that's in that price range, in the Frexenet price range?
No. Actually not. Now you're putting me on the spot.
But
because I just wanted to mention it. And I have to shout out to our buddy Armand, who poured a really fantastic Lambrusco for me at Diana's the other night. I love Lambrusco, but this was kind of a rosé Lambrusco. Now, Lambrusco is a sparkling Italian wine from the Emilia-Romagna area, and it's red. It's a red sparkling wine that's dry but fruity. And this kind of rosé-ish, this lighter version, was crisp and delightful. I think it was by Cavaccioli del Cristo vineyards.
Well, I know you're a big Lambrusco girl.
Yeah. So that was a delight. And you don't get that much.
Yeah, but it's mostly a summer wine. Am I wrong about that? People drink it all year?
It's an aperitif. Yeah. It's served frequently before a meal. Mm-hmm. And it's lower in alcohol, as many sparkling wines are. Right. So it's quite drinkable. Like
Prosecco.
Yeah. So, but not everybody goes for the sparkling red aspect. And then a terrific article, now that we're into the food and wine part of our podcast, The History of Ranch Dressing.
It's about as good an article about ranch dressing as you could hope
And
for, really.
Yes, I mean, really, it was invented by Steve Henson, who was doing a stint in Anchorage as a construction worker in right around 1950. And of course, he ended up doing some of the cooking at the whatever construction camp it was. And they don't have a lot of fresh ingredients. And he puts together this dressing with various dried herbs, and it's a hit. It's a hit. When he comes back from Alaska, he and his wife Gail move to California. They buy a ranch, and they have, it's a guest ranch. You go there, spend the night, and again, the dressing becomes a hit. They eventually change the name of the ranch to Hidden Valley.
There you go. That's the clue.
Okay. They are mixing up. It's dried herbs. And what the article says
you don't
is
jump over. Hidden Valley was the name of the dressing that took over in terms of ranch dressing in the 60s.
Yes.
That's the brand.
Well, he invented the dressing. It's not like everybody was making ranch dressing. And he invented it. The article says any home cook can make a lovely, full-flavored ranch dressing using real garlic, freshly ground pepper, and bright green herbs, but the particular flavor of traditional ranch can only be achieved with the dry versions of all those aromatics. Garlic and onion powder, dried herbs, powdered pepper, and even powdered buttermilk. And they give a recipe. So, eventually, he will sell the company.
For zillions.
Well, not really zillions. In 1976 or 78, he sells it for $8 million.
Oh, that's all?
Yeah.
Huh.
Well, it's in the 70s, so $8 million's a lot. To Clorox, who last year, I think, did, $450 million.
Yeah, I would have, $8 million is kind of a steal, but okay.
So... a lot of good stories about that. It's still being served at the nearby... Hidden Valley Ranch is not there anymore.
Okay.
But there's a nearby tavern where they served it. The lady who first tried that, when her neighbor Steve brought it over to show her, said her first taste, it took off in my mouth like a freight train.
That's what you're looking for. I mean, they do make the point that it is the most popular dressing in the United States, is ranch dressing.
Yeah, nothing's even close. 40% of people say it's their favorite.
I
the closest next one is Italian at 10%.
Yeah, it's crazy. Ranch dressing. I wouldn't have guessed.
And it's in and on everything.
Yeah. Well, you don't want
chicken wings, pizza, ice cream, there you have it.
Yeah. You have to use your discretion.
So we're ending with a little bit of reading here. There was a terrific page in the New York Times Book Review, the sketchbook page, near the end of the section. And it's the correspondence it's an illustration of letters, the correspondence of the celebrated children's book editor Ursula Nordstrom. And a lot of the letters are really pretty cute. They're two wonderful, funny people, interesting people. Which ones do you want me to read? For instance, there's one, Dear Margaret, it was good to see you this morning. I think the text of Runaway Bunny is now perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
that's Margaret Wise Brown.
Right. And then there's one to Isaac Bashevis Singer. Dear Isaac, I'm so glad, we all are, that you will write more children's books for us. To see Zlate the Goat taking shape has been a tremendous experience for me. To Edward Gorey. Dear Edward, thank you for your card telling me you are having a nervous breakdown. Welcome to the club. I think you know that I have his and her straitjackets. We don't see the rest of that letter. And there's a letter written in 1972 to someone, name omitted, saying, I am indeed distressed to hear that in the year 1972 you burned a copy of a book. We are truly distressed that you think In the Night Kitchen is not a book for elementary school children. I assume it is the nudity which bothers you, but truly it does not disturb the children.
Well, I mean, there's a wonderful group of books here that they're pictured, and she was the editor of, and they are Runaway Bunny, Stuart Little, Charlotte's Web, Where the Wild Things Are. There's a very, very nice letter to Maurice Sendak in that connection. Goodnight Moon, Harriet the Spies, Lotta the Goat, Harold in the Purple Canyon. What she writes to Maurice is...
Crayon. Harold in the Purple Crayon.
Purple Crayon, yeah, I'm sorry, Canyon, yeah.
But that's an idea.
Yeah, it is a good idea. This is to Maurice Sendak. Maybe we'll close with this. When you were much younger and had done only a couple of books, I remember I used to write you letters and thank you for another beautiful job or some such dopiness. Now you're rich and famous and need no words of wonder from me. But I must send them anyhow when I look through Where the Wild Things Are. I think it is utterly magnificent. And the words are beautiful and meaningful. And it does just what you want it to do. And you did just what you wanted to do. Okay.
Thanks. So that's all for today. This is Tamsen Granger.
And Dan Abuhoff.
With Tamsen and Dan read the paper. See you next week.
Thanks.